Hello, this is Friar Tim to all of the audience at Newman Catholic Community in Chapel Hill. Greetings from the Friar sitting room once again, where we're still under quarantine because of the flu-like symptoms of one of the friars. The friar seems to be getting better. The rest of us are doing fine. Friar Bill and I are doing fine. And as promised, today we're going to play a little bit of Stump the Chump on church history. Now, I got two questions, two emails, each of which have two questions. So I'll start with the first one that came in. First, how many and what different kinds of Eastern Catholic communities are there? And what's the difference between the Orthodox and Catholics? Okay, that's a first big question. First of all, Orthodoxy and Catholicism hold many very principal things in common. First and foremost, we both believe in the deposit of faith. We both believe in the scriptures. We both believe in the sacraments. We both believe in the principal theological doctrines regarding Jesus Christ and the Trinity. That is very clear. The major differences would involve, in the 5th century, certain Eastern churches, typically the Coptic Church of Egypt and Abyssinia, and sections of the Armenian Church, did not accept a fine point of Christological doctrine. Basically, that Jesus Christ has two natures, which is intimately connected in the person of Christ. Now, this is somewhat debated theologically how much of a difference there is, because we're really talking about the difference in translating between Greek and Coptic and very fine philosophical nuances. But in essence, those churches have separated. There's a second major break, which occurs in the year 1054 AD between the Greek East and the Latin West. And this is over cultural differences, essentially. The major differences between the Greek East and the Latin West around these points involve, first, the nature and the conception of the church. The Eastern Church has developed what's called a church polity. That is, the way in which the church organizes itself, that is much more collegial and synodal, and has to do with the fact of 5 ancient patriarchates coming together. The Western Church began to accent one of the points of the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople, which stressed that the Roman Patriarchate was primus inter pares, that is, first among equals. In the Latin West, with no other patriarchates in the West, the Latin West developed a little bit more of a monarchical model, which eventually culminated in the 1870 theological definition of the Roman pontiff having immediate and direct jurisdiction over all other churches, as well as papal infallibility when he speaks ex cathedra regarding faith and morals. So those are the major differences in polity. Because of the differences in development over the course of time, the Eastern churches do not recognize some of the theological developments that occurred, most particularly because of the scholastic theological movement in the Latin West during the Middle Ages. So typically there would be some disagreement over the question of original sin. There would be some disagreement over the question of the Immaculate Conception. And there would be some disagreement over the question of purgatory. In addition, the Greek East and the Latin West have different ways of conceptualizing the internal life of the Trinity. But the reality is that the major piece is probably the question of the role of the papacy in a church that is both communio and synodal, as well as with a certain primacy that is given to Rome. The extent of that primacy, the East would hold to primacy of honor, the West would hold to primacy of honor and primacy of jurisdiction. Those are the major points. Now, the number of Eastern churches. Well, I already pointed out the Coptic Church. There is a Coptic Orthodox Church and a Coptic Catholic Church with Abyssinian, Ethiopian, and Egyptian rankings. There are also the Armenian Church, the Armenian Catholic Rite, and the Armenian Orthodox Rite. There's also the Chaldean Catholic Church and the Chaldean Orthodox Church. Within the Greek variety, since the Greek variety emanating out of Constantinople and embracing Greece also co-evangelized the Balkans and the Slavic peoples, the various Slavic groups that were evangelized by the East tend to have a Byzantine form of liturgy. So this would include the Greeks, this would include the Romanians, this would include the Russian Orthodox, the Ukrainian Orthodox, etc. The Ukrainian Orthodox, there's also a Catholic variety, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. There's also a Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church that we call Ruthenian, from Rutenorum, which is the Latin word for Russians. Basically, the shorthand is, if it says Catholic in the title, they're in union with Rome. If it says Orthodox in the title, they're not in union with Rome. The last of the branches would be the Syriac Church, which is mainly in the Middle East area. However, the Syriac Rite, both Eastern and Western versions of it, emigrated to the west coast of India, and today are what are called the Malankar and Malabar Catholic churches, in addition to being the Orthodox varieties of them, the Syriac churches in those areas. Lots of confusion around all of these questions. Again, many of these churches remained in full communion with the Latin Church, essentially the Maronite Church of Lebanon. Many others re-entered into communion from the 11th century on. The final spurt of this was in the post-Tridentine age, when the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Catholic Church, and the Syro-Malabar Catholic Church in India, as a result of colonialization, all came in. So this is a question of Eastern Catholics and the Orthodox in a very kind of a brief way. Secondly, if a Catholic is in Russia with no access to a Catholic church, to what degree can he or she participate in Russian Orthodox sacraments? Okay? The Roman Catholic Church recognizes the validity of the orders of the Russian Orthodox, and in fact all Orthodox and Eastern churches. Therefore, the Eucharist is valid. However, because we are not in full communion of belief, discipline, and practice with these three churches, they do not allow us and we do not allow them to engage in intercommunion with us. However, since it is a valid Mass, to go and participate in Mass without receiving communion fulfills your Catholic obligation to assist at Mass on that day. Okay, let's go to the second person here. Give me a second. There we are. When did Christians discern / believe / understand that Christ had, capitalized, to die on the cross in order to fulfill the scriptures? A very complex theological question here. Early on, the church fully understood that we are saved by participation in the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ. This is the basic notion of early on attaching the celebration of Christian initiation to the Easter Vigil, the great celebration of Easter. The date of Easter is already set in the middle of the 2nd century, and the rites of Christian initiation for adults, the earliest testimony we have of them is of the early to the middle part of the 3rd century. So these are very, very ancient. Now, did Christ have to die on the cross to save us is another whole kind of a theological issue. I suspect the way in which you're hearing it is what is called atonement theory. And atonement theory is the theory that began to be propagated in the 11th century by Saint Anselm in his famous theological text, Cur Deus Homo? Why did God become a man, human? And here, Anselm propagated the notion that the unbridgeable divide between us and God, occasioned by human fault and human sin, needed to be bridged and gapped by God becoming flesh and dying to redeem us and ransom us. Now, that tends to be the majority theological opinion, the majority theological way of talking about it. I would refer you back, however, to yesterday's FriarSide chat, in which I talked about the whole Franciscan approach on the Feast of the Incarnation, the Feast of the Annunciation. And that is, the Franciscan approach sees human salvation not being so sin-focused, but rather being more focused on the incarnation. Now, there's a great amount of theological opinion today and theological issue concerning the whole role of violence and God. And many people find the atonement theory particularly disturbing because the atonement theory basically demands that violence be done to the Son of God in order to save us, and therefore in some way violence is sacred. However, there are other strands of extremely sound Catholic practice and sound Catholic doctrine that would underline, for example, the incarnational aspect of all of this. That is, that the death of Christ was not absolutely willed by the Father, as if the Father wants some kind of bloody, violent act to please the Father. In fact, the bloody act of the crucifixion was really our choice. The very, very traditional Italian hymn sung during the reproaches on Good Friday is Sono stati I miei peccati, O Signore perdon pietà. Lord, it was my sins that crucified you. Have mercy on me, O Lord. So this collective sense that somehow the human condition came together and did violence to the Son of God, not following necessarily God's command, but because of our fallen human nature, is another whole way into the question. Now, let me get to the second. Quote, and then, of course, how grotesque to condemn, capitalized, and then persecute Jewish peoples for centuries for their capitalized necessary foreordained role in this plan of salvation. Again, complicated. Necessary foreordained role. Nothing of this was necessary for God. God does not foreordain a people to have crucified his son. This is a question of what we did. And in fact, most scholars today are much clearer that it was not, in fact, the Jewish people that put Christ to death, but in fact, the Roman people. Now, this gets into another whole question of the growth of anti-Semitism and how the growth of anti-Semitism within Christianity connected to the whole Passion narrative. This is another whole wider question. The separation between Judaism and Christianity in the early centuries was a problematic one. We get echoes of this in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of John, in terms of, for example, just this past Sunday's Gospel. The Jewish authorities kicked out the man born blind from the synagogue because he embraced and would not condemn Jesus. That is probably an echo of what was happening in the second half of the first century. So there's somewhat of an unhappy split that occurs. When Christianity becomes the dominant religion in the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the doctrine of supercessionism is then talked about. And supercessionism is the doctrine that the new covenant, inaugurated by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, supersedes the old covenant given to Abraham. And therefore, this supersessionism makes us, the covenanted people, and the Jewish people somehow alien to this. This leads to a certain amount of low-grade persecution, low-grade second-class status. Jews, for up until the 19th century, were simply permitted to exist with no rights whatsoever involved in it. Within the 11th century, there begins to be much more of a theological development about the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, which gets much more formalized, eventually being expressed in the doctrine of transubstantiation, and at the same time, much more emphasis on the humanity of Christ, thanks to the Franciscan school, again, of which I talked about yesterday. The confluence of these things together began to exercise in popular imagination the notion of two things. One, as the Jewish people as being deicides, that is, killers of God, executors of Jesus Christ, historically not accurate. And secondly, also the whole question of profaning the Eucharist for Jewish uses, what is known as the so-called blood libel. These things together began to come together to really attack Judaism strongly around these issues. The The last thing to keep in mind around the question of Judaism as well in this point is that the doctrine of supersessionism was formally and completely censured at the Second Vatican Council in the 1965 decree called Nostre Aetate, in our age. However, there is still a great amount of animosity because of the long centuries of what was first religious anti-Semitism, and upon this basis of a religious anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th centuries was built and constructed a racial anti-Semitism which found its flower, unfortunately, in the Holocaust and the Shoah. In the same way, the tensions between the Eastern churches and the Latin Western Church were exacerbated by acts of violence and acts of unfriendliness over the course of centuries, most particularly the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which sacked the city of Constantinople. Again, on both of these instances, the Church has asked Christians to purify their memories and to expunge from the bloodstream of the Church and from the bloodstream of each individual person any notion of anti-Semitism or any turning towards violence for the sake of the truth or any trampling of human rights in terms of their conscience. Again, thank you for listening. This one went a little bit longer than usual. So I would ask us now to pause for just a moment in prayer and pray for two things. One, for the full unity of Christ's people. And secondly, for increased sensitivity and dialogue between Christians and our elder brothers, the Jewish people. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness you have given us many gifts to offer, grown from the earth and the work of our hands. May they become for us always signs of your presence. Amen. God bless, and see you tomorrow.